in this scenario. Type 1 error is when you reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative when the null is actually true. So the null hypothesis is that the rack can hold 100 pounds of force. If we're to reject the null, that would be we're saying that the rack cannot hold 100 pounds of force. It looks like the rack holds less than 100 pounds of force. We're going with the alternative, but in reality, we were wrong, and the rack can hold 100 pounds of force. Okay, so we're supposed to identify the type 1 error. The researchers state that there is sufficient evidence to conclude the rack holds greater than 100 pounds of force. So with the type 1 error, you're rejecting the null in favor of the alternative. Being greater than 100 pounds of force is different than being less than 100 pounds of force, right? So that's not a type 1 error because we're not rejecting the null in favor of an alternative. That's rejecting the null in favor of some other hypothesis. Second option, the researchers state that there is sufficient evidence to conclude that the rack holds less than 100 pounds of force when the rack actually holds 100 pounds of force. So this is our type 1 error. Because this one says, the first part of the sentence says the researchers say the rack holds less than 100 pounds of force. They're rejecting the null in favor of this alternative hypothesis. But in reality, the alternative is true. That's a type 1 error. You rejected the null in favor of the alternative, but in reality, the null hypothesis was true in the first place. The rack can hold 100 pounds of force. Let's just check out the other ones, see why those are wrong. The researchers state that there is insufficient evidence. The rack holds less than 100 pounds of force. Okay, so that's good so far. That's rejecting the null in favor of the alternative. Wait, what's the difference between these two? Oh, insufficient. I missed that part at the beginning. There is insufficient evidence to conclude that the rack holds less than 100 pounds of force. So that means there's insufficient evidence for the alternative. They're saying that you can't reject the null hypothesis. A type 1 error is when you do reject the null hypothesis. First part of the sentence, insufficient evidence means that you cannot reject the null hypothesis. And then that would be claiming that the null hypothesis is true. Okay, so that's saying you can't reject the null hypothesis, and it's true. The null hypothesis is a true. It is true that it can hold 100 pounds of force. The last one, the research insufficient evidence conclude the rack holds more than 100 pounds of force when the rack actually holds 100 pound force. Again, so this is saying that you cannot reject the null hypothesis. Insufficient evidence that it holds more than 100 pounds of force. 100 pounds of force is holding more than 100 pounds of force isn't part of either of these, the null or the alternative. So that's another reason to reject that one. So second option is correct here because it's saying that you reject the hypothesis that you can hold 100 pounds of force. But actually, the null hypothesis is true. It can hold 100 pounds of force.